Human being was killed. Person with potential, that had family that loved him, that had activities that that person was engaged in. He had a life. There were things that he was good at. There were things he was bad at. He was a person, just like any other person. And in being a person, that life had value. Now that value was snuffed out by a cop, just being a cop, on an average day at the office that turned into anything but an average day at the office. A spotlight was put on Minneapolis, Minnesota after the killing of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. Despite the charges to Chauvin and to the other 3 officers that basically stood there and watched a 9-minute murder as it was committed. There has been an amazing upshow of support, not just in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but literally around the world, with people supplementing or supplanting their own angst and rage and indignation at their local governments. And I mean this domestically, meaning domestically from their standpoint, but also in the United States. Sanders ran for 8 years, and for the last 4, screaming, "Are you willing to fight for somebody in the way that you're willing to fight for yourself?" Those people said yes, and those people immediately threw their bodies in the streets. Now, the catch becomes, what happens? Not just overall, I mean, you have this large movement of people out in the streets saying defund the police, and you have a political instrument that is inattentive to that. I would argue again that the issue about policing really does boil to, in some part, an issue of poverty. The moment that you say get rid of policing or defund police, what is the operative, logical question that people don't entirely know what they mean to ask? What do you mean get rid of the cops? Now the catch becomes, the catch becomes, why do you need the cops in the first place? That just seems to be the most logical question in the world. If you're going to say we need to do something with cops, the first question is, why do you need cops? You need cops to keep order. Well, what kind of order? Is it an order that we like? That's the first point. On the second point, is it possible that the order that you're trying to keep and the thing that you're trying to keep in contact with is the level of inequality that is within a system that is trying to rip itself apart as people, whether they know it on a intellectual level or not? Think that something is fundamentally wrong with the system. And so you have millions in the streets, continuing in the streets despite the charges. The question becomes, what does Minneapolis do? With all of the emphasis that's been put on Minneapolis, with all of these people around the world, they have to be feeling a certain amount of pressure to do something. Now, Minneapolis City Council has disbanded, or disbanded is the wrong word. They've gotten rid of or put through the process of getting rid of the police department and replacing it with a community policing model. Now, this is extremely interesting because, again, these guys were up against the wall with all the pressure that was put on them. I would like to make a very basic point in this video, though. Changing the police misses the main part of that equation, and that's dealing with the poverty that necessitates, conceptually anyway, the need for those cops. You should defund the police, and you should immediately take that money and invest it into aspects that will create thriving communities. Now, whether or not there's enough money into the police budget to do that is almost secondary to the fact that you should do that. And you should find other money to ensure that your communities are thriving. I'm making the very basic point that if you really indeed want to get rid of cops, if you really want to defund the police, you have to deal with the fact that your black body was a commodity and brought over to this country to be so. And it had the unique distinction of being a commodity that knew it was a commodity, but in no way could access the value of the commodity itself, meaning themselves. And they had cops to ensure that that commodity stayed where that commodity was. And they enshrined laws to ensure that that commodity could never access the value of itself, let alone anything else. That has created a wealth disparity going to the tune of 176,000 to 18,000. Shocking. Very shocking. That's kind of why I get to the basic point that if you really indeed are trying to get rid of cops, your plight really is hiding behind that. Eliminate poverty. I am going to give applaud to Minneapolis Police Department or Minneapolis City Council for doing that. But I'm also going to show you Jacob Frey's response when he was confronted with Black Lives Matter protesters who eventually, I suppose, went to his house in order to protest. I'm going to show you his response. I'm going to show you what City Council is doing. And I'm going to make a very basic point that they at least I think they miss, and that their problems will still be there. Like, say for the moment, you got rid of cops. And this is not being postulated, but you got rid of cops. And in doing so, what's left? Understand what I'm asking you. Yes, you got rid of cops. Are your communities thriving? Is that not a fair point? Do you want to keep your communities in disrepute? Meaning, the cop conversation is intrinsically linked to what type of communities do you have, and whether or not those communities are in a situation that incentivizes your city planners and your city council and your elected leaders to say, we need to drop in more cops. As opposed to, we need to do something to ensure that community is thriving in order to eliminate the need for cops. Both of those are conversations. Do we want to put in more cops, or do we want to ensure the community is healthy? Cops are a byproduct of an unhealthy community. The primary is the unhealthy community. The cop is the secondary process. I understand you want to defund cops, but let's just be very clear that that entirely means you need to do something to ensure those communities are thriving so you don't need those cops there in the first place. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This content is brought to you by you, and so I appreciate you the opportunity for allowing me to do the news. I found the story interesting, and I didn't want to bypass it because I've been putting focus on what has been taking place in Minneapolis. And I do think, considering everything that has taken place in regard to the protests, the marches, and emphasis that have been put on Minneapolis, Minnesota, I mean, after all, this was the origin of all of this, that we should keep track of what Minneapolis is doing. Hence, this episode. Mayor Frey, and Bob and I disagreed on this when I saw the video, but I'm going to show you the video. You can come to your own conclusions. Frey gets shamed. Mayor Frey is the mayor of Minneapolis, Minnesota, when he's asked about this question of defund the police. Now, he could have said yes to this, but he takes it to the maximalist position of abolish the police, and nobody, not even in the phrasing, has said that. In which case, he got viciously shamed and had to walk out in the midst of that shame. Let's hear it.
Yes or no? Will you defund the Minneapolis Police Department?
Mayor Jacob Frey answered he didn't support the full abolition of MPD, and before he could finish, we caught up with Frey minutes later. He said it's not about having everyone on his side, but about making the necessary changes.
Now, the wild part about this, and I hate that they cut that clip short. Basically, Frey gets up there and says, I agree with this, I agree with this, I agree with this. And he goes on this list of things that I am willing to do all of these things. Now, there's a video of Frey at Floyd's funeral crying at the casket. He looks like a Kennedy. He's on his knees. He's weeping. When I saw that, I thought to myself, what if he told you, I will give you everything that you asked for? I just don't want to call it defund the police. Does that happen? Because the fact of the matter is, that kind of is what he was saying. I mean, he took the maximalist position of abolish the police, fair enough. But he was willing to kind of give you a massive amount of leeway. He was stuck with this notion of the politics of saying defund the police. It looks bad. But it does seem like he is open to make adjustments. The Minneapolis City Council, and I just read Reuters, the Minneapolis City Council on Friday unanimously passed a resolution to pursue a community-led policing safety system to replace the police department following the death of George Floyd at the hands of city police. The move comes days after the veto-proof majority of the city council voted to disband the police department after the country erupted in protests over the killing of Floyd, a black man who died when a white police officer kneeled on his throat for 8 minutes and some change. Here's another one. The city council will engage with every willing community member in Minneapolis, centering on voices of Black people, American Indian, people of color, immigrants, victims of harm, and stakeholders who have been historically marginalized and underserved by our present system, the resolution says. Together, we will identify what safety looks like for everyone. Can you have safety in deep poverty? The anonymous violence of it all. Meaning, understand, that policing is being the focus of this, and the police department. And so you went after and disbanded the police department. This is Minneapolis, the other side of it that nobody talks about. 82,000 people live in poverty in Minneapolis out of 395,000. Now, that represents 1 out of every 4.8 people. The poverty rate in Minneapolis is 20.7%. Now, the question that you should ask is, well, wait, what do we mean by poverty? Now, you may have an intellectual idea of what that means. Meaning, when I say poverty, you think to yourself a certain number, a certain lifestyle, and everything else. Based on the U.S. government, when the U.S. government is talking about poverty, they're talking about a person bringing in $5,790 a year. A family of 4 bringing in $23,160. The number seems to be intentionally low to make it look as if the poverty level is lower than it is, because if that number is higher, you got to deal with that. But do you honestly believe that in America, bringing home $5,790 a year, what do you do with that? Can you pay rent with that? Can you buy your medication with that? Can you deal with your house with that? Even if we're talking about the 44% that live off $18,000 and under, that's nearly half of your population living at $18,000. The number it shocks the conscience that that number even exists in the richest country on the planet. And yet, here we are. You want to do something immediately about it? Increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Let's go back to Minnesota for the moment. I don't want to lose the thread. The poverty rate across the state of Minnesota is 10.5%, meaning Minneapolis is dramatically higher than average percentage of residents below the poverty line when compared to the rest of Minneapolis. So Minneapolis, Minnesota, 20%. The state of Minneapolis, 10%. Minneapolis is ensconced in poverty. Basically, 1/5 of every person in that area of Minneapolis is in poverty. You may have a few rich areas. You may have some areas that even tread the line, but just be very clear. Me calling it poverty, that's $5,000. Think about what I'm saying for the moment. When I'm saying poverty and I'm saying 1/5, that means that 1/5 of Minneapolis is living off of less than $6,000 a year. How many are living off of $20,000 a year? And do you believe that's dramatically better in regards to that person being able to live and make those choices that person need to make in order to kind of have a decent life? My answer to you is it is not. And that number being that low is appalling. And it's done for the politics of lying about how bad poverty actually is. If you're going to do anything about the police department, great. I applaud that. Absolutely. Go start. But I would just humbly point out that number is jarring. And if you really want to do something about the need for those cops, or for that matter, the incentive of various politicians to drop in those cops, eliminate the need for them entirely, or at the very least, dramatically, by eliminating poverty. Increases people's wages by $15 an hour. Make Medicare for all something that's legit. Deal with the education thing where people can go to school without tens of thousands of debts on their backs. And yes, reparations. I know I tend to be against this politically in the sense of trying to make the argument, but I got to be honest, after seeing everything that I've seen up to this point, I have it's difficult for me to argue against it. 176,000 to 18,000 blacks are dying 3-to-1 from COVID-19. And I have to ask myself, if healthcare was free, would those people be more likely to get healthcare? Our infant mortality rate, the number of people who are committing suicides, the people who are dying from COVID-19 that are being forced back to those service jobs. I'm just making the very basic point that if the Minneapolis City Council, or for that matter, mayor, wants to do anything, the first thing that it needs to do is get rid of poverty. Whatever crime is left after you get rid of poverty, have that conversation. But at the very least, before you do anything else, I suppose, secondly, do that. But I applaud Minneapolis for taking steps. Like, share, subscribe.